Hey friends, is it weird when you hear my voice instead of the intro music first thing? Well, the reason you're hearing my voice now is because I've got a huge announcement. I'm so excited about this. Seminary Dropout is actually about to have a new home. Next week, starting next week, Seminary Dropout's going to be hosted over at missioalliance.org. That's missioalliance.org. I have been friends with some of the people over there at Missio for a while. I really love what they do. We're really compatible. If you like the show, I think that you really like the content that's posted over at Missio. It's so far all written blog posts. There is going to be another fantastic podcast that's going to join me over there. But I'm so happy to be hosted over there. And like I said, it fits really well. And so if you listen online, please start going to missioalliance.org to hear the podcast episodes. For those of you who listen on iTunes or whatever your podcatcher of choice is, it'll still be there. Nothing will change for you. So please keep listening. Tell your friends. I think this is just a great next logical step of growth for Seminary Dropout to be hosted over at Missio. So yeah, enjoy this great interview. You're listening to Seminary Dropout, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. Somewhere in between seminary and youth camp, it's Seminary Dropout. Let's go. My guest today is Drew Hart. Drew is a theologian, blogger, and activist. His blog is hosted by Christian Century, and he speaks regularly at churches, universities, and seminaries. Drew, thanks for being back with me second time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to discuss with you once more.
Well, your new book, Trouble I've Seen, it's been out for a little while. First of all, congratulations, because I hear it's doing really well. It's already getting great reviews and already been really meaningful to a lot of people, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I've been pleasantly surprised at how well it's being received. You never know, especially when you're talking about race and racism, how well a book is going to be received. But I'm almost every day I get messages from readers who say, it was really challenging, it stretched them, but it was really good. And so that's the kind of stuff I love to hear.
Well, I mentioned this is the second time that you've been on the show. And last time we talked a lot about your background, and your background is some things that you cover in the book as well. So I'm going to try not to retread too much on stuff we already talked about. And I would encourage people to go ahead and listen to that first interview with Drew after this one, because we cover a lot of good things there. But real quick, talk to us a little bit about the environment in which you grew up. I know that you grew up going to a church that your grandfather was a pastor of, but you've inhabited a lot of kind of back and forth through some white spaces throughout your adolescent times, through high school and things like that. Can you real quick kind of give us an overview of all that?
Yeah, so I grew up in Norristown, Pennsylvania, which is outside of Philly. It's an urban, multiracial, I guess maybe, or racially diverse community. It's about a third Black, a third Latino, a third white, and then a couple other smaller people groups. And that was my world growing up. My block was mostly Black, but and so there was some kind of like semi-segregation going on, but everybody intermixed through the school systems and even just every day because Norristown's not that big. And so that was the world that I grew up in. My world quickly changed drastically around, what was that, ninth grade. We had a fire at our house and we ended up moving to the suburbs of the Lansdale area, Montgomery County, outside of Philadelphia. And that was a culture shock for me, but it was also just first time navigating a space where, I was a clear, distinct minority in a mostly white suburban, community, and trying to make sense of my own belonging there, where Norristown, where I felt kind of normal. I often say, there all of a sudden people's racial gaze was projected on me, and it wasn't in the way I expected, which I expected, people were going to pick on me as a Black kid, but instead it was that they projected me as cool. Blackness was cool in that space, and so there was a different kind of set of stereotypes that I was experiencing in that space. And then after that, went to Messiah College, and once again went through another experience of culture shock, but then also began to struggle with the way that people were gazing on me and kind of were afraid of me often. And so those were some of the key pivotal kind of shifts and moments in my early upbringing. Coming up from a Black church and then kind of being dropped into this white Christian community and trying to understand both the quirks as well as some of the ugly sides of, white Christian communities and the history of racism that has often not been dealt with. Rarely has it been discussed in any kind of thorough way. And so there's still a lot of ugly stuff residing under the surface that people aren't even aware of, I think. And so, that kind of so my own experience and upbringing kind of shaped a lot of even my book, and me wanting to write this book is deeply connected to those early experiences.
Well, in the beginning of the book, you share a story about kind of going on a trip in college, like a lot of us did, just kind of that, carefree college student experience. And then getting a call from your mom about your brother. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. It's the interesting juxtaposition between me feeling carefree as a college student. We literally took a cross-country road trip to the Washington State because we had a friend from Florida that lived there. We were just all curious about Washington State, which I found out, at least where he lived, was literally the middle of nowhere. And so we kind of enjoyed kind of going across, seeing the scenery, and it was all new to me. I didn't camp growing up and stuff like that. So we were actually literally stopped at national parks and things, So I was kind of living carefree. And throughout that experience, just kind of enjoying myself. And then I get this phone call from my mother, and I found out that my brother had been arrested because he fit the description of a Black male with a black T-shirt and blue jeans. That was the only description that they gave, and that, that woke me up to how easily Black men, particularly, but Black people in general, how vulnerable we are in our society. Because my brother, I grew up with him. We shared rooms together. People used to say that we look like twins. He's my size, my build. And he actually ended up having to spend about 4 months locked up before trial. And then eventually they dropped all the charges when it was clearly not him. But it showed how vulnerable Black people are. And for me, it was the first time that I internalized how vulnerable I was, right? I knew that this kind of stuff happened, but it was kind of out there, to other people. And so this kind of woke me up to how real it is, and how susceptible I could be also. And thankfully, things didn't end up worse than they did. That even the 4 months locked up is bad enough. But for many people, the situation is much worse than that. We have a system that just criminalizes Blackness, and we allow the kind of stopping and frisking and harassing of Black people in their own communities in a way that is never accepted in communities, in white suburban communities that I lived in also, right? In Lansdale and Hatfield and in the suburbs of Philadelphia. These things, I just never saw them while I lived there for those 3 years. And so it just kind of woke me up to these realities and how serious they are and how seriously we as the church need to respond to these issues.
Well, one of the crazy things about that story about your brother is it's not like he was taken in and released that night after they realized they got the wrong guy. He spent 4 months in jail, 4 months of his life, until finally through a lineup, he was obviously, I don't know if exonerated is the right word. It's probably more of a legal word, but where they realized it wasn't him and let him go. 4 months of his life. I don't know what his situation was, but probably hard to keep a job when you're gone for 4 months all of a sudden, support a family, things like that. He may not have been in that place in his life at the time, but for a lot of people they are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. it's a traumatizing experience overall in many ways. And the sad thing, you don't get any apologies afterwards either. You know, they just like, oops, and
Yeah,
they kind
yeah,
of
no
go on their
compensation for
business.
missing 4 months of your life. Um, yeah, and I can't imagine the psychological turmoil because he didn't know for sure that he was going to be let go. People are locked up all the time falsely for things like that, and it sounds like the the crime that they were looking for the real perpetrator for was probably a violent crime. Probably could have had some real time associated with it. And I gather that from the details that you gave in the book. I want to talk a little bit about race as a social construct because that's something that you spend some time talking about. I confess when I first heard that race is a social construct, it was so new and surprising to me. I didn't even understand it because, you know, most of us, the first time we take like a biology class, we learn that like DNA is responsible for all of our physical characteristics. So, skin color and hair, eye color, and all of that. So I think a lot of people, it's really hard for them to understand what we mean or what people mean when they say that race is a social construct.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I mean, it was something that Western Europeans invented. It was an idea that there actually are different races. So you can look, if you go back to like folks like Immanuel Kant and these Enlightenment thinkers, as there are folks that are, going and engaging, Africa, Latin America, Asia. They're doing so from a normative, making Western European ideals, values, experiences, everything culture normative, right? And so you begin to have people who actually begin to think that they can scientifically classify human beings and categorize them within a racial hierarchy. And so Western Europeans were always at the top of this hierarchy. Black people, African people were always at the bottom. And then there was sometimes some nuances in between, right? But what was clear was that white people, which was a new idea, instead of just German or whatever, it's actually now this white collective, this imagination that there is this group called white people, which if you go back to like the 1300s, that idea never existed, right? And so this is something that emerged over time that people began to think of themselves in that way. And so it was a way of othering, uh, it's not as clear cut. Like in our minds, it seems very clear cut because that's what we've been socialized into. But if I'll give a few examples to try to help to show how how much of a social construct it is. So, for example, African Americans, uh, there are many African Americans. First of all, we come in all shades and colors. Some are very light skinned, some are dark skinned, some have technically are have more European ancestry technically than African ancestry in terms of you talk about biologically and physiologically. That they might be 90%, so to speak, European, right? But they're still considered black, right? So it's not purely about ethnicity anymore. The issue isn't about ethnicity. This issue isn't about physiological difference or just our visual appearance. It's a social way of constructing boundaries and groups. And race was always about the superiority of whiteness and keeping the purity of whiteness as well. And so, one drop, that was the rule that they had, one drop rule. If you had 1% African ancestry, you were black, right? Well, that was an arbitrary, arrangement, but that was how it was defined. And so you had paper brown, black, brown paper bag tests and things like that. People were checking to try to see who was black and who they could at least identify as being black. But all of these things are social constructs. All of them are things that we've made up in our minds that aren't necessarily the same thing as talking about the various, ethnic groups and heritages and communities and cultures that inform and shape our lives. And so it's made up, it's fabricated, and I think it's helpful and important for us to wrestle with the fact that it was fabricated, but for a reason. It was always for the purpose of domination and oppression, right? Or actually, I should say the opposite. the oppression was the consequence. The goal was to benefit white people, right? So the exploitation that happened, slavery, Native American genocide, colonialism, conquest, all these things happened because white people wanted, resources and wealth and all these things. And so this racial logic, this construct of othering people according to a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority, all kind of contributed to an arrangement in which they could justify doing the things that they did, exploiting, stripping the land's resources, stealing people and coercing them into labor, removing people from their own homelands. All these things all flow out of this idea of race, which, was created. No one, if you go back early enough, people, everyone who we would say is white or black, whatever, they would not even know what we're talking about. And they wouldn't identify in this large collective group like we imagine. And even with white people, there was a time when white only meant Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? And eventually, Italians and Irish eventually were kind of assimilated in, and later in some communities, depends on where you are, Jews sometimes are assimilated in. But it shows how arbitrary it is. It can change. And it's not consistent in terms of how it identifies it. So it's always morphing and mutating. So race in the 1600s or the 1700s looks different than in the 1800s and 1900s versus 20th century and now in the 21st century. It keeps morphing to do the job that we want it to do, whether we're conscious of how it's shaping our lives or not.
The race card is something that you talk about, that we hear a lot. We hear that phrase thrown around a lot, mostly in terms of white folks accusing black folks of playing the race card. You really break that down well, and you use the Trayvon Martin shooting as an example of how white folks see that from their advantage and how people of color tend to see it from a different advantage. Can you just break down the idea of the race card and then go into what you do in the book, which is analyzing the entire deck?
Yeah, I mean, it really flowed out of, so I was giving a talk on race at the Germantown Mennonites historic meeting house in Philadelphia. And I gave a talk, and I had a gentleman come up to me. He was going on and on about how much he loved my talk and he appreciated it. And he said he loved everything that I said except the example that the actual concrete example I gave, which was of Trayvon Martin. And he didn't see that particular event in the same way that I saw it, but he agreed with my analysis about race and racism, racial hierarchy, all these things. He agreed, and he saw how valuable that was. It was meaningful. And so I was left just struggling with, how that can be that someone can agree with this broad, big range of arguments that I've just made. But when it actually comes down to the rubber meeting the road in terms of actual concrete experience, then he thinks that Black people are misreading this moment. And so that made me think about, how, and I've heard it several times, stop playing the race card. And so what I began to do is I figured, well, let me jump into this metaphor. Let's jump all the way in and explore that. And maybe within that framework, we can explore some of the problems and the limits of how people are thinking about the accusation of the race card. And so for me, playing the race card, it's really focusing on one individual card out of a whole deck, right? Just one little play. And often, so when we say, Mike Brown, had his hands up or whatever it is, or this or that, it's people are saying, well, how do you know it's about race? You're just basing it off of this one little individual events. We don't have enough information, so it's inconclusive. And if it's inconclusive, then it's not fair to be throwing around terms like race and racism, right? But for me, with the race card analogy, the problem is that Black people aren't just concerned about one individual card. So I think, in the Black community, we frequently We remember things that have happened not only to our own lives and our own neighbors and friends and family members, but also the stories that are told from our parents and our grandparents and our great grandparents. We have a much better understanding of oftentimes our 400 years of history, which oftentimes gets forgotten. Sometimes in America, we're the United States of amnesia and don't really have a sense of 246 years of slavery, another 100 years of Jim Crow, apartheid and oppression and lynching and convict leasing system, followed by the uprising of the mass incarceration and prison industrial complex and all kinds of stuff, right? So we have a much better memory often of these things and refuse to forget the past. And so kind of like a deck of cards, we're not just looking at this one deck, but a deck of cards, if you spread them out, you see patterns for kings, for queens, for jacks, for aces, there's a pattern going on. And so if you spread it out, you can begin to make sense of how they fit together. And if you put them back together again and take out one individual card, you know where that card can fit and how it plays within the larger deck. And I would say that that's kind of how the African American community frequently addresses issues of race, is that they're interpreting an individual card in light of a much larger context, right? History, stories, experiences, both personal and communal. And so it's not so individualistic. While frequently when I'm having conversations with many white people, not all white people, but many white people frequently want to only isolate an individual event, and then out of that context, or without any context, other than that event, they want to make a decision about whether race played a factor in it. And I think it's a ahistorical way of thinking about race and racism. And it's also, it doesn't take seriously sociology and sociological realities that are going on all around us. So what is widespread? These are the kind of questions that we want to ask. And I think that when you begin to pull it all together, my point is simply that, we aren't playing the race card. We're analyzing the racialized deck, and we've always seen that the deck has been stacked against us. And so I think it's a different vantage point when we look at it from a systemic standpoint and look at the racialized society that we live in, and realize that race has always been a factor in our society. We have 400 years of history, and it just doesn't go away just because you wish or will it to, or because Martin Luther King, gave a great speech. You have to work through these issues. You can't just ignore them and then hope that things just disappear on its own.
So what I'm hearing you say is, if you take an instance like Trayvon Martin or Mike Brown, if you looked around and it wasn't the case that Black folks were disproportionately policed, disproportionately shot at, that we don't have studies that show that they're arrested for drug offenses at a much higher rate than white folks, even when the use is the same. If we took away all that and we just, in this, the Trayvon Martin situation, then you might be able to say maybe there was race involved, maybe not. But because we have all of this other information that shows that it is disproportionate, then we have to say, no, race was involved in that. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, basically, look, so I can't, the challenge is that we can't ever prove that somebody's individual motives or intentions, whether
you can't see anyone's heart.
I can't prove someone's individual motives.
Right.
And that's usually what white people want to argue about, is what were people's white motives. But what we can prove is that there are racialized outcomes and consequences of our society. That, like you said, Black people are disproportionately, being stopped and frisked and arrested and given harsher sentences and such. That's facts. We know that sociologists have studied it, proved that that's not even a question. And so how can we make sense of those larger realities in light of these individual? And I think the problem is that, and sometimes we're more guilty of this in the church than the rest of society, is that we're so individualistic that we don't even know how to make sense of these institutional and structural realities around us. And we've got to bring them together, put them in conversation together. And I think that is a helpful starting point. And there's no proof, right? At the end of the day, that one thing is one way or the other. But I think, and one of the points I make later, in the book, is that we've got to kind of trust the instincts of the people who have been experiencing these realities for 400 years.
And that brings us, that's a good transition because I wanted to talk about I think you coined the term counterintuitive solidarity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about that a little bit. That's one of my favorite things you talk about in the book. And you wrote a blog post about that a couple of years ago that really stuck with me.
Yeah. Yeah, so it came out of the blog post, and I kind of just wanted to kind of expand it a little bit more for the book. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of these posts and chapters come out of just kind of frustration sometimes with in conversations around race and how they kind of turn and how people are responding to issues. And so, one of the things that I saw beginning to emerge as the Black Lives Matter movement was coming, to form, was that again, a lot of white people were making the charge that Black people were just, being manipulated by the media, and they have bad, they don't know what is racism and this and that. And so it was almost this kind of thing like they know what is racism better than Black people know what racism is. And so I was like, all right, that's an interesting argument to make. Again, I figure it's not taking seriously our history. And so what I did was I wanted us to step back and think logically rather than just with our intuitive emotions that are sometimes charged by we sometimes can get very defensive and not really think through, the implications of what we're saying. So I figured, let's walk through history. So, starting with, slavery, and I look at a different couple points, Dred Scott and, these different moments through history where all or the majority of Americans today can all agree, for example, that slavery was a horrible thing and that white people were wrong for doing it. The Black people who, like Dred Scott, who thought that it was wrong and claimed otherwise, we would all agree with them, that they were right. And so you have, 250 years of that slave history. And then, cases like, and that was with Dred Scott, that was a Supreme Court case, which overwhelmingly ruled in favor of him not being recognized as a citizen and that America was never intended for him to be a citizen. I mean, that was the case, right? And then Plessy versus Ferguson, same thing, civil Supreme Court case in which the highest court again once, affirms that, separate but equal, right? Segregation is legal and okay and right. And now we all can look back and say, that was wrong. And so both of those cases represents, the feelings and the perspectives of the white dominant culture at that time. So the majority of people at that time would have fully agreed with these court cases. It just made sense in terms of their worldview and their community, the way that they were being socialized at that particular time. It confirmed it. But we can all look back now and kind of see that, that they were wrong and that Black people should have been treated like human beings and as people who were made in the image of God. We could jump all the way up to, like, for example, the 1940s. One of the things I show is that there was a survey taken and what was it? Almost 7 out of 10 white Americans in the 1940s, I think it was 46, said that Negroes in America are being treated fairly or something to that degree.
I remember that. I love that.
Yeah, it's interesting. 70% of white, and not just in the South, it's everywhere, right? 70% thought that Black people were being treated fairly. And, we could all look back and even after that, this is still lynching time, convict leasing system just kind of ending, deep segregation, Black people still don't have a vote, deep poverty, everything is going on. This is before the water, the hoses and the dogs are, set loose on kids. I mean, there's still a deep white supremacist Jim Crow system in place in America. And yet the way that the majority of white people were being socialized was such that they were incapable of conceiving the horrors of what was going on around them and how Black people were being oppressed and abused at that time. And so if we look at that, lead that up to, pretty much it's pretty mainstream now. Most white Americans, unless you're like a hardcore KKK supremacist or something, most people would say white people were getting it wrong for the first 350 years, right? From 1619, when the first 20 Africans were brought over, all the way up to the mid 20th century, that the majority of white Americans, their social intuitions around race and racism were wrong. And that same period, 350 years, that the majority of Black people, that their social intuitions on race and racism were correct. That's not really a controversial statement, in many ways. Most people, I don't think, I still haven't found anybody that's disagreed with that statement at all. So my interest then is, if we have this tradition of 350 years of failed white intuition, and also failed white Christian intuition, because the majority of them would have considered themselves Christian at that time. And we have a 350-year tradition of Black intuitions in which they knew what was right and wrong as it related to race and racism. Now that we're about 400 years in, the question is, what's the likelihood that white people who've been getting it wrong for 350 years, 400 years in now, suddenly, randomly, inexplicably have just flipped the switch altogether, all at the same time, and now they know race and racism well, and they have suddenly become experts on race and racism, and at the exact same time, right, 400 years in, that Black people who've been getting race and racism right, according to everybody now, suddenly at the exact same moment, randomly, inexplicably, for no reason that we can explain, have lost the capacity to know their own experiences in terms of race and racism and what's going on in their lives, right? And so, I mean, what it kind of pulls us to is, either there's this really random, inexplicable situation going on that is almost magical, in which everyone swaps places instantly, or probably the more logical explanation is that, these are sociological issues going on, that dominant cultures everywhere, not just in America, but everywhere, frequently fail to be socialized in a way to see their failures and their shortcomings and the ways that they oppress and marginalize and persecute other people. And that frequently the people from below, right, the oppressed, the marginalized, have a better perspective on seeing the shortcomings and the failures of the society as it relates to their own experiences. And so if that is the case, if intuitions shaped by dominant culture, not because of someone's skin color, but because of dominant culture, are likely to blind you from the social realities of oppression going on, right? And if you're prone to see yourself as innocent, which, I mean, we have this history in America of wanting to claim innocence and exceptionalism, if that's the case, where we're not prone to want to own up to our own failures, then the solution I see is to really take seriously the Jesus that entered and became the Christ crucified, right? That entered and became the oppressed, the marginalized, the poor Jew living under Roman occupation, and look at and explore the world from that vantage point. And I think what we see from that vantage point, it's, if we're going to follow that Jesus, it's a call into, I call it counterintuitive solidarity. That is, that people from the dominant group can actually learn to not trust their own intuitions, but instead that they can actually trust, at least temporarily, begin to trust the intuitions of the oppressed, of the marginalized. And while they do that, they can actually have their own intuitions transformed, right? And so it's this counterintuitive solidarity where they're actually not trusting their own guts, actually not trusting their own socialization in the ways that they've been taught to think and see, and discuss race and racism in society. And I'm particularly talking about race and racism, but this applies to all kinds of things. So as a man, I would say the same thing, that, I need to have some counterintuitive solidarity as it relates to women's experiences, right? It's the same thing. And so there's a way in which we can not trust our own intuitions and then trust the intuitions of others. And then from that vantage point, allow our new perspective to be transformed and born out of that.
So a few things. I love what you just unpacked there. If you, and just kind of restate and oversimplify, you talk, if we could hop on our time machine and talk to white folks during slavery and ask, are black folks oppressed? No. No, they're not. And they would have, quote unquote, sophisticated arguments. And my feeling is that's how these awful theories about black folks not being fully human came about, because that's how they justified it in their minds.
Right.
And then, you fast forward to during segregation, and like you said, they felt like black folks were being treated fairly under that system. And not only that, I would imagine that they would also look back in slavery and say, no, that was wrong. But right now we're good. We're
exactly. We would never do anything barbaric like that.
Yeah, exactly. So fast forward now that we're not in legal segregation, not in slavery, we look back at those two institutions and say, no, that was wrong. But now we've got it right. Now we're all equal. And yes, to your point, it makes so much sense. And especially, I like that you said that it's counterintuitive solidarity, and it is temporary in that we develop a new intuition where we're not as blinded as we were to some of those things when our eyes are open to the systematic injustices. The other thing that comes to my mind is, I think that a lot of white folks, when we hear black folks saying that we are blinded by our privilege, like that's kind of the language that's most common to express kind of what you're talking about. I think we hear ourselves being accused of something more malicious than what black folks mean most of the time, if that makes sense. Because it's to be blinded by our privilege, it's not a personal thing so much as kind of what you referred to earlier, an institutional thing, that if you grow up white in the United States, well, of course you're not going to see the things that black folks see. It's not like a malicious choice that someone has made. It's the product of the environment that they grow up in. Am I on to anything there?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been actual resources that have made that point. So, for example, a classic book from the early 21st century, Divided by Faith, they did research. These are two Christian sociologists. And one of the things that they found was that white people that had many black networks began to see things very differently, right? But it was the white people that had very few or little or none actual meaningful relationships beyond not just like their black friend, right? But actual like in community networks, right? Yeah. That the less someone had that, the less they were able to even discern institutional racism at all. And so they only talked about racism from an individual standpoint. But as people developed these deeper networks of relationships in communities, right? The more that they were able to articulate these systemic and institutional realities that were oppressing people. And so, it's people are not limited by their skin color to be able to see or not see. It really has to do with participating in communities and being socialized in communities that think and discuss these realities outside of the actual experiences of oppressed people, right? And so that it's more of a in-group, out-group kind of conversation, which, black people are lazy, black people are this, that. Right. But it's not actually shaped by actually seeing and living meaningfully and deeply within these communities in a way that can actually kind of nuance these kind of black and white stereotypical, frameworks that people think about race and racism through.
I mean, I can think about, just for a real world example, the neighborhood where me and my family live, that's historically black and probably more divided between Mexican American folks and African American folks now. But because I live here, I noticed that, like, hey, how come those wealthier neighborhoods all have nice sidewalks and we don't have any sidewalks? It's literally harder to get around here. Right. Those are things that I literally would not be able to see if I didn't live here, if I wasn't part of it. If I lived in the burbs or, a wealthier neighborhood, that's literally a small thing that I would not be able to see otherwise. Yeah. So I've steered this conversation more on a sociological level,
Yeah.
But you in the book are very intentional about centering all this around Jesus. And you mentioned earlier about Jesus' place in society, that he was Jewish and that he was poor, neither of which were advantageous for social mobility during his time. Talk a little bit about how, for a Christian, the way we see Jesus kind of frames the way we see race in America today.
Yeah, I mean, and that this is so huge, and I, in some ways, even though probably people probably think I was too preachy with like, what's this whole chapter on Jesus and all this stuff, but the reality is I still think like it doesn't even do justice because it really centers around Jesus much more than we can even realize, especially because in the West, Jesus was eventually severed from his Jewishness, right, and kind of recast as a Western hero, so to speak, right? I often say he's the best. He's believed then to be the best of the West, right? And represent all that is good about Western society and culture and civilization. And so, when Jesus takes on blonde hair and blue eyes, and is owned by the West, when he becomes a possession, right, for whiteness, that has huge implications for the church as he's severed from his Jewishness, and has huge implications for how we think when Jesus is, and when we can. It's not only that he's severed from his Jewishness and becomes white, but then that he's domesticated and watered down so that Jesus, he's more of an idea. He's a principle, or he's a person, but the details are missing on his life, right? And so we care about, claiming Jesus, but we pay very little attention to the birth, the life, the teachings, the death, the resurrection of Jesus, right? The actual details of Jesus, they're inconsequential. I mean, we recognize that they're there, but there seems to be a gap between this Christ that people worship and then the Jesus that is revealed in Scripture. The Jesus that is revealed in Scripture, there's no question that he identified deeply with the poor masses, with the Samaritans, right, with the outcasts, with vulnerable women. That's not even a debate, right? That he became crucified, which meant he joined the thousands upon thousands that were crucified under Rome. He wasn't the only one, right? And so those details are not controversial, but we kind of extract Jesus from that reality and kind of just worship this Jesus that floats above it all. And so that doesn't challenge us in terms of our way of life, our discipleship, our everyday witness in our society. And so we have a lot of work to do then to both recenter or remember that Jesus is Jewish, right? That he's a son of Abraham, so to speak, and remember him in that context and what it meant for him to be a poor Jew living under Roman occupation, right? To remember that context and not let that get lost so that we're kind of Americanizing everything that he said. It had a particular meaning at that time, and we need to wrestle with what he said. And a lot of it is very radical and subversive when we keep and we remember the context in which he lived in. So when we begin to do that, we see a Jesus that is drawing all of us to join and gather around his body in this new kingdom of God, right? This new reality, this new order in which the least, the last, and the lost, are centralized, are valued. Just where they had always been marginalized and ignored and displaced, and we thought, everything centered around, Caesar or Herod or Pilate. And then Jesus comes along and flips the script, and now all of a sudden Caesar, he's barely mentioned, right? He's in Luke 2, he's taking his census, and yet he has no clue that the savior of the world is right under his reign, right? Even as he's taking a census, which is some kind of irony there. But on the other hand, it's the marginalized shepherds, right, that are kind of given this privileged seat of experiencing the birth of the Messiah. And so I think that we can begin to see the way that God moves, I say at the axis of vulnerability in society, and that is particularly revealed in the crucified Christ, where Paul says in 1 Corinthians that God has chosen the weak to shame the strong. He's chosen the things that are nothing to shame the things that are something, right? And so there's a unique way that the cross, the crucifixion of Jesus reveals God's activity and God's power in the world in a way that looks nothing like Caesar and looks nothing like the wisdom of this world and those we think are so amazing, and that we're the people that we're prone to turn our eyes towards. Those are the very people and realities that are turning our eyes away from the crucified Christ in the world, the living presence of Jesus in the world as well, who still continues to do the same kind of work that Jesus did 2,000 years ago, and we got to remember that message.
I mean, we really turned Jesus into like a motivational poster, right? Like he's the one that we also identify him with success in a really perverted way. Like Jesus is the one I call on to kill it in the business meeting, right? And I think too, this all stems from Constantine and Christendom, and I think that's why Anabaptism is so perfect for reorienting who Jesus was and reorienting our lives around it, because, for those listening, Constantine comes to power, and for the first time Christians have power and are picking up the sword for the first time. The images of Jesus turn from this poor Jewish person who was oppressed to this victorious military leader. And it seems like that is really where it went wrong, and where we lost our orientation as Jesus as someone who had solidarity with the marginalized and the oppressed.
Yeah. I mean, I think the history of Christendom is hugely important in all of this. I think the one challenge, though, that I often bring to Anabaptist communities is that I think they stop short. So they recognize this history of Christendom, but they don't see how Christendom itself actually mutates into white supremacy, right? And so I think that many Anabaptist communities, while they have this understanding that Christianity should not be a top-down coercive reality in society, have not always been a good witness as it relates to the mutations that turned into white supremacy and living a counterexample in those things, right? And so I think those are some of the challenges I kind of want to push for the Anabaptist community as I engage them. Is like, yeah, you got half of it right? There's this other half that's missing,
Just
right?
keep
and
going.
We need to address, and they're interrelated topics. And race, I mean, J. Cameron Carter got at it well, right? It's a theological problem, right? We don't always recognize that a lot of it is deeply theological. It's not just a social reality. It's a theological problem that we need to address and take seriously.
Well, Drew, we could seriously talk about this for a lot longer, and we've only scratched the surface of the book. I have to say that, this is the book that I have been waiting for my white Christian friends who really do love Jesus. They've been exposed to too much Fox News and garbage and kind of been brainwashed. And this is the book that I've been waiting for, that I can hand them and say, this is what I want you to know. And so thank you for it. Thanks for talking with me, and well done.
Oh, thank you, Shane. Thanks for having the conversation. I really appreciate it. Always good.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Remember, you can find all the show notes for this show and all shows at shaneblackshear.com. Oh, and hey, have you ever thought about starting your very own podcast? I bet you have. And I think you should do it. In fact, I've created a course just for you to teach you everything that I've learned over the last couple of years producing Seminary Dropout. So if you're interested in podcasting and want to learn how, go check out my course. You can go there by typing in podcastingforeveryone.org. And you can get a special discount by typing in the discount code Seminary Dropout, all one word. That'll give you 25% off. So go check it out. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay. Thanks to those that left ratings and reviews on iTunes this week. Remember, that keeps the show front and center. Also, remember, you can find me on Twitter at @beardonabike. That's @beardonabike. Also, I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/ShaneBlackshear123. And remember that Seminary Dropout is listener supported. You can visit supportseminarydropout.com and press Become a Patron. Remember, this music you're listening to right now is by D.L. Rossi. You can find him online on iTunes and at dlrossi.com. All right, thanks again for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Love you. Take care. But